What if a single letter, sent discreetly, without headlines or press conferences, could dismantle a century-old economic alliance? On July 10th, a document shocked North America, a 35% tariff on all Canadian imports. No negotiation, no warning, just power, exercised without a word. While the United States expected outrage, Canada responded with something much more calculated: silence. But it wasn't just about trade. It was about control, trust, and how a silent action triggered a powerful global shift. What followed wasn't a trade war, but a complete restructuring of alliances. And the consequences? They're still unfolding. Let's break them down. Number 1. The silent shock. On July 10th, something happened that at first didn't seem like a big deal. No cameras, no press conference, no flood of tweets. Just a digital notice buried in a government archive and a formal letter sent directly to the Prime Minister of Canada. But that letter hit like a sledgehammer. Starting August 1st, all Canadian imports to the United States would face a 35% tariff. No exceptions, not steel, not paper towels, not pharmaceuticals. Every product, every shipment. There was no preparation, not a hint of debate in Congress. No consultation with American businesses. Just a cold, unilateral decision made in absolute silence. And that silence was deafening. Washington didn't just set a new policy, it completely upended the landscape. Previous tariffs had been selective, strategic, aimed at specific industries. But this was a scorched-earth move, a message wrapped in legal jargon. For decades, Canada and the United States have built one of the most integrated supply chains in the world. Overnight, it was fractured. Global markets took notice. Investors panicked. Economists desperately searched for answers. Border states, which rely heavily on Canadian goods, were left in confusion. How could something so serious happen without more of an uproar? It was no accident. It was strategy. This wasn't just about trade. It was a test of power, influence, and loyalty. And it was carried out with surgical precision. The United States acted and waited for the fallout. Number 2. Canada's unexpected response. The world braced for a forceful response, a harsh press release, an emergency summit, or at the very least, an angry tweet. But none of that came from Canada. No uprisings, no dramatic press tours. Instead, Canada responded with something much more disarming: a calm and calculated silence. Behind the scenes, Canadian leaders and industries acted quickly, but without fanfare. Provinces like British Columbia and Alberta ramped up trade negotiations with Asian markets. Quebec sought new pharmaceutical and manufacturing partnerships in Europe. And federal officials quietly began unofficial diplomacy with key allies in Tokyo, Brussels, and Jakarta. Canada wasn't asking for exemptions, it was building alternatives. Instead of retaliating with flashy counter-tariffs or public outrage, Canada took a long-term view, restructuring supply chains, opening new trade routes, and reducing dependence on a neighbor that had just become unpredictable. Businesses were urged to adapt, not to react. Quiet conversations replaced public grandstanding, and little by little, the global narrative began to shift. The world took notice, not just of Canada's restraint, but also its speed. Within weeks, new trade agreements were drafted, industries were redirected. Delegations quietly flew abroad with a single message: if the United States shuts its doors, we're ready to move into other countries. This wasn't passivity, it was precision. Canada's silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. And while U.S. policymakers expected Canada to buckle under pressure, they underestimated the power of quiet resilience, because the real reaction didn't come from the North, it came from home. Number 3. The United States starts to feel the heat. Just 2 weeks after the tariff announcement, the pressure didn't mount in Ottawa, it spilled over in Michigan, New York, and Ohio. The border states that rely heavily on Canadian imports were the first to feel the impact. Prices for lumber, machinery parts, and even frozen foods shot up overnight. Some products went up by 20%, others by as much as 40%. Factories in Detroit and Buffalo reported delays and material shortages. Public housing projects suddenly came to a halt because building materials like light steel frames and flooring became unaffordable. These weren't luxury items. Many came from Ontario and Quebec, just a few hours away. Now, with a 35% tariff applied, they might as well have been shipped from the other side of the world. American companies weren't just frustrated, they were also caught off guard. Many hadn't received any warning, no notice at all. For a long time, they had relied on the stability, reliability, and mutual benefit of the trade relationship between the United States and Canada. Suddenly, they found themselves caught in a political storm with no shelter. Business owners flooded local representatives with letters and phone calls. Chambers of commerce started organizing emergency forums. Politicians who had previously praised the tariff for being tough on trade were now scrambling to contain the damage in their own districts. Meanwhile, Canada kept its cool. There were no televised crises or mutual accusations, just quiet diplomacy and a swift diversification. That contrast became impossible to ignore. The more chaotic things looked in Washington, the louder Canada's silence seemed, because it was no longer just about rising prices, it wasn't just about lumber, steel, or pharmaceuticals, and it wasn't just about money, it was about something deeper. Number 4. The message behind the tariff. At first glance, the 35% tariff seemed like a bold economic move, but beneath the numbers there was a message, a warning disguised as policy. For Canadian businesses, it wasn't just a tax, it was a threat: move your operations to the U.S. or lose access to the largest market in the world. This wasn't about fair competition, it was pure pressure. Small and medium-sized businesses in Canada suddenly found themselves cornered. Relocating to states like Texas or Ohio meant millions in new costs, rebuilding supply chains from scratch, and abandoning systems they had optimized over decades. For most, that wasn't an option, but staying meant taking on unbearable losses or leaving the U.S. market entirely. Take the medical device industry as an example. An Ontario company might export precision equipment worth tens of millions of dollars a year. Its workforce is skilled, its operations are efficient. Now, they're told, pass the cost on in your price. The same story repeats itself on farms in Saskatchewan, tech hubs in British Columbia, and pharmaceutical labs in Quebec. These companies aren't luxury goods producers, they're essential to the North American economy. Ironically, the American companies that depended on these Canadian components also got caught in the crossfire. The strategy started to look less like protectionism and more like strategic coercion, forcing relocation through economic pressure. This wasn't just a tariff, it was a forced rewrite of the North American trade playbook. And even though policymakers in Washington thought they were in control, the real shift in power was just beginning. Number 5. The silent counterattack. While the headlines focused on the political drama, Canadian companies were already making their next move, quietly, strategically, and precisely. They didn't take to the streets, they didn't beg for exemptions. Instead, they went straight to Washington armed with data. Industry leaders, trade associations, and supply chain analysts launched an intense lobbying effort, not through the media, but via official lobbying channels. Their message was clear: this tariff doesn't just hurt Canada, it hurts the United States too. Take copper, for example. Canada supplies more than 50% of all U.S. copper imports, a crucial product for everything from electric vehicles to data centers and renewable energy infrastructure. Just days after the tariffs were announced, copper prices skyrocketed. A cable manufacturer in Illinois reported a 37% increase in costs in just 10 days. New orders were put on hold. Expansion plans were postponed. In the pharmaceutical sector, the disruption was even more alarming. More than 90% of pharmaceuticals made in Canada crossed the U.S. border at least twice before reaching American patients. The tariffs threatened not only profits, but also access to essential medicines. Hospitals, pharmacies, and distributors in both countries began to raise red flags. But what's most remarkable is that Canada didn't dramatize any of this. There were no bold accusations or emotional appeals. Just data, spreadsheets, supply maps, and direct contact with U.S. lawmakers. Calm, professional, and devastatingly effective. Instead of retaliating, Canada simply revealed the truth. Breaking a deeply integrated supply chain is like pulling a thread from a piece of fabric. It doesn't just tear the Canadian economy, but also the American one. Number 6. Global repercussions. Allies start to reconsider. When the United States ramped up the pressure on Canada, it wasn't just Ottawa that took notice. Quietly, the rest of the world took note and began to ask tough questions. If this could happen to Canada, a G7 country, a defense partner, the second most important trading ally of the United States, who is really safe? In boardrooms across Europe and Asia, strategies began to shift. ASEAN countries sped up bilateral talks with Canada, aiming to strengthen textile and electronics trade. Japan began holding closed-door meetings to explore long-term cooperation in the pharmaceutical and clean technology sectors. And in Brussels, EU leaders quietly deepened their dialogue with Ottawa about the security of the electric vehicle battery supply chain and rare earth materials. What started as a standoff in North America began to have repercussions on global trade routes. While the United States resorted to tariffs and unilateral influence, Canada leaned toward alliances. In just a few months, Canada signed a preliminary agreement with Indonesia on the supply of electric vehicle batteries, expanded its logistics agreements with Germany and the Netherlands, and moved forward to join the CPTPP, opening access to a broader trade network in the Pacific. One by one, nations began to recalibrate their policies, not with loud declarations, but with discrete agreements, practical changes, and greater independence from U.S.-centered supply chains. The former allies weren't distancing themselves in protest. They were protecting themselves against unpredictability. The irony? The United States, in trying to centralize control, was quietly becoming an outlier. Global partners didn't need a warning. They just needed to see how the United States treated its best friend. But perhaps the most surprising power move was silence. Number 7. The power of strategic silence. In a world obsessed with instant reactions and loud statements, Canada's response was almost unsettling. No emergency press conferences, no dramatic speeches to rally public opinion, no threats or ultimatums. Just a discreet and deliberate strategy based on internal strength and long-term vision. While U.S. headlines decried trade wars and economic aggression, Canadian officials worked behind the scenes, refining trade routes, strengthening business confidence, and doubling down on diplomacy. Provinces like Ontario and Quebec didn't take to the streets. Instead, they sent letters, held private forums, and urged Ottawa to stay the course. No blame, no panic, just clarity of purpose. And perhaps the most unexpected reaction didn't come from politicians, but from the people. Instead of fear or outrage, Canadians responded with patience. Not because they were asked to, but because the government's calm inspired it. The message was unspoken, but clear: we will not be provoked into chaos. It's easy to interpret silence as weakness, but in this case it became a form of power. By refusing to join the noise, Canada made its voice heard more strongly than ever. While Washington tried to assert its control through policies, Canada quietly earned the world's respect with its composure. Behind the numbers and the negotiations, a deeper question began to form: One that had nothing to do with taxes or trade deficits, because when you strip away the politics, the exports, and the spreadsheets, what remains is trust. Number 8. What if the real cost is trust? Tariffs can come and go. Policies change with elections. Even broken supply chains can be rebuilt over time. But trust, that's a different story. When the United States suddenly imposed a 35% tariff on Canada without warning, it didn't just disrupt trade, it shook the foundations of one of the world's most stable alliances. It wasn't just about economics, it was about reliability, respect, and whether longtime partners could still count on each other when it mattered most. Canada's response wasn't forceful, but it was enough. It prioritized strategy over emotion, choosing the diplomatic route and letting actions speak louder than outrage. This revealed something much more unsettling. If this could happen to Canada, the United States' closest neighbor, who is really safe? That's the question other nations are asking themselves and acting on. Discrete realignments are taking place. Global trust is being recalculated, not because of a war or a disaster, but because of a decision made quietly. And as alliances begin to shift and trade maps are redrawn, the damage could go far beyond product prices or policy papers. Because once trust is broken, it rarely returns to what it was before. So here's the question we leave you with. In a world that looks for power moves with lots of noise, is silent strength the real game changer? Tell us in the comments, what's more important in a relationship, dominance or mutual respect? And if this video gave you a new perspective, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay with us as we explore the quiet changes shaping our world. If this story made you stop and think, leave your thoughts below. We read every comment, and your voice is what truly matters here. And if you found this eye-opening, check out our latest video. It connects the dots in a way headlines just can't. These videos take hours of research and passion, so if you believe in what we do, hit that subscribe button. It's just one click, but it means a lot to us. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next deep dive.